Now let's talk about something else that China seems to be disrupting. The US-Europe bonhomie. French President Emmanuel Macron was in China over the past few days. He held talks with China's Xi Jinping. He discussed the war in Ukraine and the tensions over Taiwan. But it was also a business trip, a way to get China to sign more trade agreements with France. And what was the outcome of the trip? Not too many tangibles. China refused to condemn Russia for its invasion of Ukraine. It refused to make any assurances regarding Taiwan. In fact, as soon as Macron was out of the Chinese airspace, China began its latest round of drills around the island. But both Macron and the Chinese media are hailing the trip as a huge success. Why? Because both sides believe it was a shot in the arm for European strategic autonomy. First, let's understand what that is. What is European strategic autonomy? It means that the European Union is acting independently of the US when it suits European interests. It means the EU not following America's lead in all conflicts and behaving like an independent global power. The question is, can Europe afford to do that? Also, why is Macron championing this cause? Because he doesn't want to fight with China. Remember, the US has promised to defend Taiwan if China attacks, and China has promised to take Taiwan by force if needed. Now, Emmanuel Macron says Europe should not get caught up with this. Washington has labeled Beijing as its greatest threat. It is fighting trade wars with China. And all of this affects Europe too. If European companies do certain businesses with Beijing, they face American sanctions. And this also limits Europe-China trade prospects. The French president wants to change all of that. So does German Chancellor Olaf Scholz. He went to China last November to discuss trade. But it's a tough balancing act. Europe depends on the US for military protection, protection which seems imperative considering what's going on in Ukraine. So it can't really afford to anger Washington beyond a point. But Emmanuel Macron says the EU should not follow the US policy everywhere, that European nations should not become American vassals, because they will suffer in the event of a US-China conflict. It's typical Europe. Remember, China overtook the US as Europe's largest trading partner in 2020. We mentioned this last week too. Now, Europe is suffering a cost of living crisis, mostly because of the war in Ukraine. And China's help will be essential in getting European economies back on track. So Europe is not very keen on this whole talk of decoupling with Beijing. They are more keen on what Macron is advocating. Ignore the US and keep dealing with China. It's like having your cake and eating it too. Just under the fancy label of European strategic autonomy. Now, of course, China wants all of this to happen as well. Trade with Europe would continue to boost China's economy. It also drives a wedge between America and its traditional European allies. It's a win-win for Beijing, really. And that could explain why China rolled out the red carpet for Macron over the weekend. He was invited to tea ceremonies. He was speaking at schools and basically swarmed by a fawning Chinese audience, like a French emperor visiting the grand Chinese court. And Macron wants the world to lap it all up. This is what he put up on his Twitter handle today.
Alors, oui.
Nous avons aujourd'hui à œuvrer pour éviter toute escalade et tout à la fois préserver et réinventer un ordre international de paix et de stabilité.
It's a stark contrast from his current predicament at home. For months, French people have been protesting. They've been protesting Macron's pension reforms. He has rammed through a law that raises France's retirement age from 62 to 64. The people are not happy about this. Violent clashes keep erupting between the police and the protesters. Strikes in every sector of the economy. Garbage being lined up across Paris. Could this trip to China have been a way for Macron to appear like a global statesman? Is that why he's championing European strategic autonomy as a way to avoid his domestic embarrassments? Macron's China trip makes him seem more grandiose than what his political realities suggest. But will the world really buy it? Whatever the French president's motives, China seems happy. And the US will have to start keeping an eye on its allies in Paris.